What if the most powerful man in an empire was invisible? What if behind every decree, every war strategy, every political alliance that shaped the fate of thousands, stood someone the world was never supposed to see? Someone whose name was erased from official records, whose face was forbidden from portraits, whose voice was silenced in public chambers, but echoed in the Sultan's private ear every single night. I found something buried deep in old Portuguese merchant letters, in Arabic manuscripts hidden in Omani archives, in whispered stories passed down through Swahili fishing villages. And what I found changes everything we thought we knew about power, about slavery, about who really controlled one of the richest empires of the 18th century. This is not a story about a slave who escaped. This is the story of a man who conquered from within. A man who wore chains on his ankles but placed crowns on the heads of sultans. If you feel that pull in your chest right now, that need to know more, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will stay with you for the rest of your life. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at history the same way again. The name they gave him was Mwinyi Baraka. But his true name, the one whispered by his mother on a moonless night in the heart of the Congo Basin, was something else entirely. Something the empire tried to bury forever. The waters surrounding the island still remember. They carry that particular shade of turquoise that seems to hold secrets in its depths. That specific quality of light that turns everything golden at dusk and blood red at dawn. Stone Town rises from the coastline like a coral reef that learned to breathe, its narrow streets twisting and folding upon themselves in patterns that mirror the complexity of the human heart. The carved wooden doors, some standing for 3 centuries now, bear the marks of hands that once knocked seeking fortune, seeking refuge, seeking power. Behind one of those doors, in a courtyard where jasmine vines grew so thick they blocked out the equatorial sun, decisions were made that would ripple across the Indian Ocean and touch the shores of 4 continents. The Palace of Wonders they would later call it, though in 1798 it bore a simpler name, a name that meant nothing more than the place where the Sultan sleeps. But the Sultan, as history would reveal, rarely slept alone in his thoughts. There was always another mind present, another intelligence operating in the shadows, another pair of eyes reading the correspondence before the royal seal was ever broken. The thesis of this story is not about the triumph of good over evil. It is not about justice in any simple sense. It is about the most dangerous weapon ever forged by human civilization. The weapon of an extraordinary mind, shackled to an extraordinary will, waiting in patient silence for decades until the moment of transformation arrives. And when that moment came, on a humid evening in the month of Ramadan in the year 1798, the entire architecture of East African power shifted on its foundations, not with armies, not with rebellions, not with blood in the streets, but with a single conversation that lasted until the muezzin called the faithful to prayer at dawn. What was said in that conversation, what promises were made, what threats were issued, what futures were bargained, we will uncover together. But first, you must understand the world that created the man. You must smell the cloves drying on the rooftops. You must hear the creak of dhow masts in the harbor. You must feel the particular weight of chains designed not to restrain the body, but to crush the spirit. If you want to follow more cases like this, ones that shake the very foundations of what we think we know about our past, and reveal truths that have been deliberately hidden, subscribe to this channel so you never miss another investigation. The Sultanate of Zanzibar in the late 18th century was not merely a political entity. It was a machine, a vast, intricate, perpetually hungry machine that consumed human beings at one end and produced wealth at the other. The island itself measured only 37 miles in length and 24 miles at its widest point, a speck of coral and limestone floating in the Indian Ocean. Yet from this speck, tendrils of power extended across an empire that stretched from the coast of Mozambique in the south to the trading posts of Somalia in the north, from the clove plantations of Pemba to the ivory routes that penetrated deep into the African interior, reaching places no Arab or European had ever seen. The harbor at Stone Town could hold 300 vessels at anchor. On the busiest days of the trading season, when the monsoon winds shifted and the dhows arrived from Muscat, from Gujarat, from the Malabar coast, The count often exceeded that number. Ships stacked so close together that a nimble child could cross the entire harbor by leaping from deck to deck without ever touching water. And what those ships carried, what they unloaded onto the coral stone quays, what they loaded into their holds for the return voyage, was the currency of an age that measured human beings by weight and age and the condition of their teeth. The slave market occupied a plaza near the waterfront. It operated every afternoon except Friday, opening when the heat began to subside and closing when the evening prayers called merchants away from commerce and toward contemplation. Estimates from that period suggest that between 1770 and 1800, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 human beings passed through that plaza every year. Not all remained in Zanzibar. Most continued onward, to the date plantations of Oman, to the pearl diving operations of the Persian Gulf, to the households of wealthy merchants in India, to destinations so distant that the enslaved could never hope to find their way home, even if they somehow achieved freedom. The process of sale followed rituals refined over centuries. New arrivals from the mainland were kept in holding pens near the harbor, structures of coral stone with thatched roofs that provided minimal shelter from the equatorial sun. They were fed twice daily, a gruel of sorghum and coconut milk designed to keep them alive but never strong enough to resist. They were washed each morning in seawater, their skin oiled with coconut fat to give it a healthy sheen that would attract buyers. Those who showed signs of illness were separated and either treated if they seemed valuable enough or simply abandoned to whatever fate awaited them in the narrow alleys behind the market. When sale day arrived, groups of 15 to 20 were led in chains to the plaza, where they were arranged in rows according to age and gender. Buyers circulated among them, examining teeth, testing the flexibility of joints, checking for scarification patterns that might indicate tribal origin. Certain tribes were prized for certain qualities. The Makonde from the southern interior were valued for their endurance. The Nyamwezi from the lake regions were sought for their intelligence. The Yao, who often served as middlemen in the slave trade themselves before finding themselves on the wrong end of a transaction, were prized as household servants for their knowledge of multiple languages. Prices fluctuated based on supply, demand, and the perceived quality of the individual. A healthy adult male in his prime might fetch 40 Maria Theresa dollars. A skilled craftsman with demonstrable abilities could command twice that. A young woman of certain physical characteristics, destined for the harems of wealthy men, might sell for $100 or more. Children were cheaper, their potential unrealized, their survival to adulthood uncertain in an age of high mortality. But occasionally, very occasionally, a slave would arrive whose value defied normal calculation. Someone whose abilities were so extraordinary, whose potential so evident, that buyers would engage in fierce competition, driving prices to levels that made the ordinary merchants gasp and shake their heads in disbelief. The Sultan himself maintained agents at the market, men authorized to bid on his behalf for individuals who might prove useful to the royal household. These agents had standing orders to watch for certain qualities: literacy in Arabic, knowledge of languages, skills in medicine or astronomy, familiarity with the courts and customs of foreign lands. The palace consumed these exceptional individuals the way the ocean consumes rivers, absorbing them into a vast bureaucracy where they might find themselves doing anything from copying manuscripts to mixing poisons, from teaching the Sultan's children to disposing of his enemies. It was into this machine that a young man arrived one afternoon in the dry season of 1771, chained at the ankles like all the others, his body bearing the marks of a long and brutal journey from the interior. He was tall for his age, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, though no one thought to record his exact birth date. His eyes held a quality that made the experienced traders uneasy, a steadiness that suggested depths they could not fathom. When the Sultan's agent first saw him standing in that row of human merchandise, something unusual happened. The agent, a man named Salim bin Hamad who had spent 30 years identifying talent for the royal household, felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. In all his decades of service, he had felt that sensation only twice before. Both times, the individuals he had purchased had gone on to change the course of Zanzibari history. This boy, this unnamed captive from the Congo Basin, would prove to be the third. The young man who would become Mwinyi Baraka did not speak for the first 3 months of his captivity. This was not unusual among new slaves, particularly those who had witnessed the violence of their capture and the horrors of the long march to the coast. What was unusual was the quality of his silence. Other slaves in the royal household observed that he seemed to be listening with an intensity that went beyond mere survival instinct. He was cataloging, processing, storing information in some internal archive that would prove, in time, to be far more valuable than any ledger or manuscript. His first assignment was the most menial work available in the palace complex, carrying water from the cisterns to the various chambers and courtyards where it was needed. This task required him to traverse nearly every section of the sprawling compound multiple times per day. Within 6 weeks, he knew the layout of the palace better than servants who had worked there for decades. He knew which doors squeaked and which opened silently. He knew which guards could be bribed and which remained incorruptible. He knew the precise times when certain courtyards fell into shadow and when the afternoon light streamed through specific windows. He knew the names of every concubine in the harem, the dietary preferences of every official in the bureaucracy, the sleeping habits of the Sultan's own mother. He knew because he listened. And because everyone assumed a water carrier could not possibly understand the sophisticated Arabic they spoke, they talked freely in his presence about everything. The first person to recognize his intelligence was not an Arab, but another African slave, a woman from the Yao people named Fatima, who served as a midwife in the women's quarters. Fatima had been in the palace for nearly 40 years, long enough to have assisted at the birth of the current sultan himself. She noticed the boy's eyes one evening as he filled a basin for her use. Those eyes, she would later tell others, were not the eyes of a servant. They were the eyes of someone taking measurements, someone preparing for something. Fatuma began leaving small items for him in exchange for his silence about certain activities she conducted on the side, specifically a profitable trade in contraceptive herbs that she sold to concubines desperate to avoid pregnancy. The items she left were not food or coins but something far more valuable: pages torn from old manuscripts, discarded correspondence that literate servants were supposed to burn, scraps of paper bearing Arabic script that most assumed a Congo boy could never decipher. She was wrong about his inability to read. He had learned the Arabic alphabet from a Muslim trader who had passed through his village years before the slavers came. Within months of receiving Fatuma's scraps, he had progressed from basic recognition to fluent reading. He devoured everything she could provide: histories of the Omani dynasty, trade agreements between Zanzibar and various European powers, personal letters between the Sultan and his relatives in Muscat, poetry from the classical Arabic tradition, theological debates between different schools of Islamic jurisprudence, scientific treatises translated from Greek and Persian. The more he read, the more he understood the architecture of the world that held him captive. And the more he understood that architecture, the more clearly he saw its weaknesses. Leave in the comments, never give up on the truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. His transition from water carrier to something more began with a crisis that no one in the palace could resolve. It was the year 1775, and a delegation had arrived from the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, bearing a letter that required urgent response. The problem was that the letter was written in Portuguese, a language that none of the palace scribes could read. The usual translator, an aging Goan Christian who had served the court for decades, had died the previous month. His replacement had not yet arrived from India, and the Portuguese delegation was growing impatient, threatening to interpret the delay as an insult to their colonial governor. The young man who would become Mwinyi Baraka heard about this crisis from the whispered conversations of anxious courtiers. That night, he did something that could have resulted in his immediate execution. He approached the chief scribe directly and claimed he could translate the letter. The chief scribe, a man named Abdullah bin Rashid, laughed in his face. A Congo slave? Reading Portuguese? The idea was absurd. But the scribe was also desperate, and desperation makes men willing to entertain absurdities. He agreed to test the boy's claim. What followed became legend in the palace. The young slave not only translated the Portuguese letter accurately, but did so in elegant Arabic prose that matched the rhetorical sophistication of the original. He then, without being asked, offered a detailed analysis of the political implications of the Portuguese governor's demands, and suggested 3 possible responses, each with its own strategic advantages and risks. The chief scribe sat in stunned silence for a long time after the translation was complete. Then he asked a simple question: how? The answer revealed a mind that operated on principles most people could not comprehend. During his years as a water carrier, the young man had deliberately positioned himself near conversations involving foreign visitors. He had memorized Portuguese phrases and syntax simply by listening. He had then compared what he heard with the scraps of Portuguese trade documents that occasionally circulated in the palace, reconstructing the language through pure pattern recognition. He had done the same with basic Dutch and English. His intelligence was not merely retentive, but synthetic. He could perceive underlying structures and relationships that remained invisible to ordinary minds. Within a week, he had been reassigned from water carrying to the translation office. Within a year, he had become the chief translator, producing work of such quality that visiting diplomats began to suspect the Sultan must be employing someone trained at the finest schools of Europe. Within 3 years, he had become something that had no official title in the palace hierarchy. The person consulted before any important decision was made. His owner was still technically the Sultan. His status was still technically that of a slave. But power, as he was learning, had little to do with technical status. Power flowed to those who possessed information, and no one in the Sultanate of Zanzibar possessed more information than the young man who had once carried water through its corridors. The horrors he witnessed during his rise did not diminish with his elevation. If anything, his increased access to palace affairs exposed him to atrocities he had never imagined during his years as a menial laborer. He saw the torture chambers beneath the palace, where enemies of the state were kept alive for months as information was extracted from their bodies piece by piece. He saw the disposal of inconvenient concubines, women sewn into sacks and thrown into the harbor after dark for offenses as trivial as speaking out of turn. He saw children sold away from their mothers to satisfy debts owed by palace officials who had gambled too recklessly. He saw the casual violence that punctuated daily life in an absolute monarchy, the beatings and maimings that occurred whenever someone in authority experienced a moment of displeasure. And he saw, most devastatingly, the systematic way in which the slave trade operated as the economic foundation of everything around him. The beautiful mosques and elaborate palaces, the luxurious textiles and exotic spices, the poetry and music and refined conversation that made Zanzibar a center of culture and learning, all of it rested on a foundation of human suffering so vast that the mind recoiled from contemplating its full dimensions. The moment that transformed mere observation into something darker occurred in the year 1779. A new shipment of slaves had arrived from the interior, and among them was a young girl who caught the attention of a powerful court official named Sulaiman bin Hamoud. Sulaiman was known throughout the palace for his particular tastes that had resulted in the deaths of several young slaves over the years. He purchased the girl at auction and brought her to his quarters in the palace compound. What happened next was never officially recorded, but the screams that emerged from Sulaiman's chambers that night were heard by everyone within 100 meters. And the body that was carried out the following morning, wrapped in blood-stained linen, told a story that required no translation. The young translator, by now known throughout the palace as Mwinyi Baraka, meaning Master of Blessings, witnessed the disposal of that body. He was present when Sulaiman laughed about the incident with other courtiers, describing it as an unfortunate accident, joking that he would need to be more careful with his new purchases in the future. He was present when the Sultan received a report of the incident and dismissed it with a wave of his hand, declaring that what a man did with his own property was no concern of the state. He was present, and he remembered, and something inside him began to calculate with a precision that would take another 19 years to bear fruit. The path from witness to actor required patience, the kind of patience that most human beings cannot sustain, that burns itself out in fits of rage or slowly dissolves into resignation. Mwinyi Baraka possessed a different kind of patience, the patience of stone slowly shaped by water, the patience of roots working their way through cracks in solid rock. He understood that direct confrontation would lead only to his own destruction. A slave who raised his hand against a master, no matter how justified, would be executed in the most public and painful manner possible, his death serving as a warning to others who might harbor similar thoughts. Even a slave of his intelligence and value could be replaced. The system was designed to produce replacements endlessly. But the system, he began to realize, had vulnerabilities. Not in its physical structure, not in its military force, not in its religious legitimacy. The vulnerability lay in the minds of those who controlled it. These were men who believed themselves wise, who had been told from birth that their right to rule was ordained by God, who had never been challenged by an intellect capable of exposing their limitations. They made decisions based on assumptions they never examined, pursued strategies whose flaws they could not perceive, trusted advisors who told them what they wanted to hear, rather than what they needed to know. Mwini Baraka began, very slowly and very carefully, to position himself as the exception to this rule. He became the advisor who told the truth, but only when the truth served his larger purposes. He became the translator who conveyed not only words but contexts, helping the Sultan understand subtle implications that others missed. He became the analyst who could predict outcomes with uncanny accuracy, earning trust through a series of correct forecasts that seemed almost prophetic. And with each increment of trust, with each expansion of his access, he gathered information. He documented the crimes of powerful men. He mapped the rivalries and resentments that simmered beneath the surface of court unity. He identified those who might be persuaded, those who could be bribed, those who harbored secret sympathies for the enslaved. He built over nearly 2 decades a picture so complete and detailed that when the moment finally arrived, he would know exactly which strings to pull. The decisive break came on the night of August 17, 1798. The Sultan at that time was Sayyid bin Ahmed, a man of moderate intelligence and immoderate appetites who had ascended to power 3 years earlier, following the suspicious death of his elder brother. Sayyid was not particularly cruel by the standards of his era and position. He was simply indifferent to the suffering of those beneath him, viewing slaves as necessary instruments for the maintenance of the lifestyle he considered his birthright. He had grown to depend on Mwini Baraka for nearly everything related to foreign affairs, trade negotiations, and the complex diplomacy required to maintain Zanzibar's position between competing European powers. But he had never, until that night, invited the slave to speak candidly about matters beyond his official portfolio. The occasion was a private meeting following a state dinner that had ended badly. The French ambassador had delivered an ultimatum. Either Zanzibar would agree to exclusive trading rights that would effectively make the Sultanate a French protectorate, or the French Navy would blockade the harbor until the Sultan reconsidered. The British, meanwhile, had sent word through unofficial channels that they would view any arrangement with France as a hostile act requiring military response. And the Omani relatives who provided crucial military support expected the Sultan to maintain an independent position that preserved their own interests in the region. Sayyid had no idea how to navigate these competing demands. He had dismissed his usual advisors in frustration after they offered nothing but platitudes and warnings. He had retreated to his private chambers with a bottle of date wine and a deepening sense of panic. And then, on an impulse he would never be able to explain, he had summoned Mwini Baraka. "What do I do?" the Sultan asked. It was a question he had never asked a slave before, at least not about matters of such consequence. And it was a question that Mwini Baraka had spent 19 years preparing to answer. The conversation that followed lasted until dawn. It began with the immediate crisis and expanded outward to encompass the entire strategic situation of the Sultanate, its economic foundations, its military vulnerabilities, its political structures, its social tensions. Mwini Baraka spoke with a depth of knowledge and clarity of analysis that left the Sultan alternately astonished and ashamed. Astonished at what this slave knew and understood. Ashamed at how little he himself had perceived about the empire he supposedly ruled. But beyond the analysis was something else, something that emerged only gradually as the hours passed and the candles burned low. A vision, a possibility, a future that the Sultan had never imagined because no one had ever presented it to him with such compelling logic. Mwini Baraka proposed not merely a solution to the immediate diplomatic crisis, but a fundamental transformation of the Sultanate's position in the world. He described how Zanzibar could leverage its geographic location and commercial relationships to become not a pawn of competing empires, but a power in its own right, playing European nations against each other while building independent strength. He outlined specific steps: modernizing the harbor facilities, establishing direct relationships with American traders who were emerging as a counterweight to European domination, reforming the administrative system to reduce waste and corruption, and, most radically, beginning a gradual transition away from the slave trade itself. This last proposal might have seemed suicidal for an economy so dependent on human trafficking. But Mwenye Baraka had calculated the numbers. He showed the Sultan projections demonstrating that the clove trade alone, properly managed and expanded, could generate revenue exceeding current slave trade profits within 15 years. He described how the growing international movement against slavery would eventually force change regardless of what Zanzibar preferred, and how nations that led this transition would be positioned advantageously while those that resisted would be destroyed. He argued not from morality, which he knew would carry no weight with Sayyid, but from cold strategic logic. And watching the Sultan's face in the guttering candlelight, he saw something he had waited 19 years to see: a mind beginning to change. The months following that night saw changes that rippled through every level of Zanzibari society. The Sultan announced a series of reforms that his advisors initially attributed to the French pressure, assuming Sayyid had somehow negotiated a compromise. The truth was more complex. Mwenye Baraka had proposed a diplomatic stratagem that played French and British interests against each other while committing Zanzibar to neither. The plan required precise timing, deliberate ambiguity, and a willingness to take risks that the previous court advisors would never have countenanced. It worked. By the end of 1798, both European powers had backed away from their ultimatums, each believing they had achieved a satisfactory outcome, while neither had gained the exclusive advantage they sought. The Omani relatives grumbled, but accepted the result, particularly after Mwenye Baraka arranged a series of trade concessions that sweetened their position. The Sultan, for the first time in his reign, felt genuinely in control, and he knew exactly whom to thank. The elevation of a slave to the position of chief advisor could not be done openly. The social and religious structures of Zanzibari society would never have tolerated such a formal acknowledgement. But informal power, as Mwenye Baraka had long understood, was often more valuable than formal authority. He was given a new title, Mashauri Mkuu, which translated roughly as Great Consultant, a position that had no precedent in palace hierarchy, and therefore no constraints. He was given quarters in the palace itself, unprecedented for someone of his status. He was given, most importantly, the Sultan's ear at any hour of day or night, and he used that access with the same methodical patience that had characterized his entire life in captivity. The reforms came gradually enough that each one seemed reasonable when considered in isolation. A new system for documenting slave sales that required buyers to provide guarantees of minimum treatment standards. Restrictions on the worst physical punishments, justified as protecting valuable property from excessive damage. Educational initiatives for slaves in the royal household, framed as investments in improving their usefulness. Each reform chipped away at the absolute power of slaveholders while appearing to serve their own interests. Some understood what was happening. Suleiman bin Hamoud, the official who had murdered that young girl 2 decades earlier, was among the first to sound the alarm. He accused Mwenye Baraka of pursuing a hidden agenda, of using his position to undermine the natural order of society, of being a secret revolutionary masquerading as a loyal servant. But Suleiman's accusations fell on deaf ears. He had made too many enemies over the years with his cruelty and corruption. When he pushed too hard against the Sultan's trusted advisor, he found himself facing accusations of his own. Accusations supported by documentation that had somehow found its way into official hands. Documentation of embezzlement. Documentation of unauthorized agreements with foreign merchants. Documentation of private communications with rival claimants to the throne. Suleiman was executed in the public square 3 weeks after launching his attack on Mwenye Baraka. Officially, his death had nothing to do with his accusations against the slave advisor. Officially, he had been found guilty of treason, based on evidence that had surfaced through normal investigative channels. But those who understood power in Zanzibar recognized the message. Challenging the shadow behind the throne was no longer safe. The system Mwenye Baraka built over the following years was not a sudden revolution, but an architectural transformation, each element supporting the others, each change creating the conditions for the next. He established a network of informants throughout the palace and the city, enslaved and free alike, who reported to him on everything from market prices to political conspiracies. He cultivated relationships with foreign merchants and diplomats, becoming the essential intermediary for anyone who wanted to do business with the Sultanate. He identified promising individuals among the enslaved population and created opportunities for their advancement, building a cadre of loyal supporters who owed their positions to his intervention. He reformed the palace bureaucracy, replacing corrupt officials with competent ones who understood that their continued employment depended on maintaining his favor. And he waited, with the patience that had defined his entire existence, for the moment when the final transformation could occur. That moment came in the year 1804. A smallpox epidemic swept through Stone Town, killing thousands and creating chaos in the normal operations of government. The Sultan himself fell ill. For 3 weeks, he lay in his chambers, drifting between fever dreams and brief periods of lucidity. The court physicians offered contradictory diagnoses and ineffective treatments. Rival factions began maneuvering for advantage in the event of Sayyid's death, each supporting different claimants to the throne. The empire seemed on the verge of civil war. During those 3 weeks, Muini Baraka effectively ruled Zanzibar. He issued orders in the Sultan's name, maintained essential government functions, managed the response to the epidemic, and systematically neutralized the most dangerous rival factions through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and strategic arrests. When Sayyid finally recovered, he found that his advisor had not merely preserved the throne, but had strengthened it immeasurably. The Sultan's gratitude was enormous, and his dependence was now absolute. In recognition of this service, Sayyid took an unprecedented step. He summoned the Qadi, the chief Islamic judge, and formally freed Muini Baraka from bondage. The ceremony was private, witnessed only by a handful of trusted officials. The news was never publicly announced. The social implications would have been too explosive. But from that day forward, the man who had spent 33 years as property was legally a free man. A free man with more power than anyone in the Sultanate except perhaps the Sultan himself. And even that distinction, as the following years would reveal, was more nominal than real. The legacy of what Muini Baraka built extended far beyond his own lifetime. The reforms he initiated, the networks he established, the strategic direction he set, would shape Zanzibar for the next century. The gradual transition away from slave trading that he advocated would eventually accelerate, driven by British pressure, but facilitated by the economic alternatives he had begun developing. The administrative systems he created would survive multiple changes of ruler, becoming the institutional foundation of the modern state. The relationships he built with foreign powers would evolve into the complex web of treaties and agreements that characterized Zanzibar's position in the colonial era. But more than any institutional achievement, his legacy lived in the minds of those who knew his story. In the slave quarters of the palace, his name was whispered with something approaching reverence. Among the free African population of the coast, tales of his rise from cargo to counselor became parables of possibility. Among those who still trafficked in human beings, his memory served as a warning that the people they bought and sold contained depths they could not fathom, capabilities they could not anticipate, plans they could not prevent. He died in the year 1819, having outlived 2 sultans and advised a third. His death was recorded in official chronicles with a brevity that belied his importance. This year also died Muini Baraka, who served the throne with great skill. No monument was erected. No tomb marked his passing. The precise location of his remains has never been determined. But in the narrow streets of Stone Town, among the families descended from those he helped to free, among the scholars who have pieced together his story from fragments scattered across multiple archives, his memory endures. The slave market that once occupied the plaza near the waterfront was closed in 1873, 5 decades after his death. On that site today stands the Anglican Cathedral of Christchurch, its altar positioned precisely where the whipping post once stood, where the bodies of those too weak to sell were beaten as a demonstration of control. Inside the cathedral, a simple plaque acknowledges the history of the ground on which it stands. But no plaque mentions the man who began the process that would eventually lead to that closure. No plaque tells visitors about the water carrier who learned languages by listening through doors, who built networks of intelligence that spanned an empire, who transformed the intimate counsels of a sultan into an instrument of change. This is the erasure that power inflicts on those it cannot acknowledge. The official histories of Zanzibar speak of enlightened rulers who gradually recognized the evil of slavery and moved to eliminate it. They speak of British pressure and international treaties and the inevitable march of progress. They do not speak of the African mind that planted seeds of transformation decades before any European power took serious interest in abolition. They do not speak of the patience required to work within a system of absolute brutality, seeking leverage where none seemed to exist, building toward outcomes that might not be achieved until long after one's death. They do not speak of Mwinyi Baraka. The Portuguese merchants who passed through Zanzibar in the early 19th century left scattered references to an individual they called the Black Vizier. Their letters describe a man of extraordinary presence, equally comfortable discussing Islamic jurisprudence and European commercial law, who seemed to know everything about everything and everyone. They noted that no significant decision was made in the Sultanate without his involvement. They observed that free Arabs treated him with a respect that bordered on fear. They remarked that he had somehow escaped the fate common to powerful slaves, the sudden fall from grace that usually preceded sale or execution, maintaining his position through multiple changes of ruler. They wondered in private correspondence whether he might be something more than he appeared. Perhaps an agent of some foreign power. Perhaps a religious figure of secret significance. Perhaps simply a phenomenon that defied normal categories. What they could not imagine was the simplest explanation: that an enslaved African, through nothing more than intelligence, will, and time, had made himself indispensable to the operation of an empire. The concept did not fit within their mental frameworks, and so they invented more complicated theories that preserved the assumption of African incapacity while accounting for the evidence before their eyes. This is how power protects itself, not through denial but through alternative explanation, through narratives that acknowledge exceptional individuals while maintaining the categories that make such individuals appear impossible. In the fishing villages along the Zanzibari coast, a different kind of memory survives. The stories told there do not concern diplomatic negotiations or administrative reforms, or the grand sweep of historical change. They tell of a man who appeared one day at a village on the northern tip of the island, traveling alone despite his known importance, asking to speak with the eldest residents. They tell of questions he asked about their families, their ancestors, the traditions that had survived from the time before the Arabs came. They tell of his particular interest in anyone who remembered the old routes into the interior, the paths by which people had come to the coast before those paths became highways of human trafficking. They tell of his silence when these elders finished speaking, a silence that seemed to contain multitudes, and of the way he left without explanation, walking north along the beach until he disappeared from view. What was he looking for? The stories offer no clear answer. Perhaps he was searching for traces of his own origins, connections to the homeland he had lost as a child. Perhaps he was conducting some sort of intelligence operation, gathering information for purposes known only to himself. Perhaps he simply needed, occasionally, to escape the palace and its endless calculations, to breathe air that did not taste of power and compromise. Or perhaps, as one elderly fisherman told researchers decades later, he was trying to find a path back, not a literal path to the interior but something else, a way of returning to whatever he had been before the slavers came, a way of recovering the name his mother had given him, the name that belonged to someone who was not a slave, not an advisor, not a player in the great game of empire, but simply a person. A human being with a history that preceded his captivity, and an identity that could not be reduced to his function. If this is what he sought, the evidence suggests he never found it. He remained Mwinyi Baraka, master of blessings, the man whose extraordinary capabilities had earned him extraordinary power within an extraordinarily brutal system. He remained the shadow behind the throne, the mind that guided an empire, the living proof that the categories upon which slavery depended were fictions maintained by force rather than truths confirmed by nature. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the demonstration itself was the achievement. Perhaps showing what was possible, even under impossible conditions, was the victory that mattered more than any personal recovery. The question that echoes across 2 centuries is simple. Was it worth it? The reforms he implemented saved lives. The networks he built created opportunities for others to rise. The strategic direction he set contributed to the eventual end of the slave trade in the region. These are real accomplishments with real consequences. But they were achieved through collaboration with a system that continued, throughout his lifetime, to consume human beings by the tens of thousands. He did not overthrow that system. He could not have overthrown it. The forces arrayed against any attempt at direct confrontation were overwhelming. But does that strategic reality excuse the accommodation? Does the impossibility of revolutionary change justify working within structures of absolute evil? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that every person confronts, in some form, when faced with systems of injustice too powerful to destroy through individual action. The choice is never between pure resistance and pure collaboration. It is always between different kinds of accommodation, different balances of compromise and integrity, different calculations about how much good can be achieved at what cost to one's own soul. Winnie Baraka made his calculations. He paid his costs. He achieved what he achieved. And the judgment of history remains, appropriately, unresolved. Some see in his story a tale of triumph, the ultimate victory of human intelligence over human cruelty. Others see a tragedy, the story of a brilliant mind corrupted by proximity to power, using its gifts in service of a system it should have sought to destroy. Both readings contain truth. Both miss something essential. Perhaps the most honest response is simply to witness, to see this man as he was, in all his complexity and contradiction, his extraordinary gifts and his impossible constraints, his achievements and his compromises. To resist the temptation to reduce him to a symbol, either of inspiration or of warning. To acknowledge that he was finally a person who made choices under conditions most of us cannot imagine. A person whose choices continue to raise questions we cannot definitively answer. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our world forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so that I can get to know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if the story of Mwinyi Baraka touched your heart. Share it so that his memory is never forgotten. The tides still rise and fall in Zanzibar harbor. The call to prayer still echoes from mosques whose foundations were laid with wealth extracted from human suffering. The narrow streets of Stone Town still twist and turn in patterns that would be familiar to anyone who walked them 2 centuries ago. And somewhere in those streets, in courtyards overgrown with jasmine, in archives filled with crumbling documents, in the memories of families who have passed down stories for generations, fragments of a life persist. Fragments that may never be assembled into a complete picture. Fragments that scholars continue to discover and debate, adding pieces to a puzzle that grows more complex the more closely it is examined. The man who was brought to the island in chains, who carried water through palace corridors, who taught himself languages no one expected him to understand, who rose to the highest levels of power while remaining legally property until his 40th year, who served 3 sultans and buried 2 of them, who planted seeds of change that would take decades to flower, who never found a way back to the name his mother gave him but made the name they gave him into something that echoes still. The candles that burned through that decisive night in 1798 are long extinguished. The men who sat in that room, sultan and slave, ruler and advisor, are dust and memory. The decisions made in those hours have been absorbed into the vast flow of history, their specific contribution impossible to isolate from the countless other factors that shaped what came after. But something was set in motion, something that mattered, something that continues to matter. When young people in Zanzibar today learn about their history, when they understand the system that once treated human beings as merchandise, when they ask how such a system could ever have ended, part of the answer involves forces and treaties and international pressures that make sense in textbooks. But another part of the answer, the part that cannot be reduced to political science or economic analysis, involves human beings who refused to accept that the world had to remain as it was, who worked in whatever ways they could find to make it different, who understood that transformation often begins not with dramatic confrontation, but with patient accumulation, small actions building toward outcomes that may not be visible for decades. Mwinyi Baraka was one such human being, perhaps not the most famous, certainly not the most celebrated, but real, present, acting, changing what he could change while bearing what he could not, living proof that the categories imposed by the powerful are never as solid as they appear. Living proof that intelligence, patience, and will can accomplish what violence and desperation cannot. Living proof that even in the darkest systems human beings have created, there are always those who see differently, think differently, act differently. And that difference, however small it may seem against the vast machinery of oppression, is never without consequence. The afternoon light falls differently now on the plaza where the slave market once stood. Tourists photograph the cathedral. Children play in the shade of trees that did not exist in the 18th century. The guides who lead walking tours mention the history of the site, describe the numbers, try to convey something of the horror. They do not mention Mwinyi Baraka. His name does not appear in the standard narratives. His role remains confined to specialized academic texts, debated by historians who argue about the reliability of sources and the interpretation of fragmentary evidence. But history is not only what official sources record, it is also what persists in other forms, in stories and memories and the living traditions of communities. And in those forms, resistant to the erasures of official narrative, something of the man endures. A water carrier who became an empire's architect, a slave who made himself indispensable to those who owned him, a mind that saw further than its masters and used that vision to bend the course of events toward outcomes they never anticipated. A person who was reduced to property and proved, through decades of patient work, that the reduction was a lie. This is the story that the documents partially reveal. This is the legacy that survives despite the effort to bury it. This is Mwinyi Baraka, whose name meant Master of Blessings, and whose life remains a blessing to all who learn of it. A reminder that human beings are always more than the categories imposed upon them. A testament to what intelligence and will can achieve even under conditions designed to make achievement impossible. A challenge to those who believe that power structures are permanent and change is impossible. A whisper across 2 centuries, still asking questions that have no final answers, still demonstrating truths that some would prefer to forget. The waves continue their eternal conversation with the coral shore. The monsoon winds still shift with the seasons, carrying dhows across the Indian Ocean on routes that merchants have sailed for millennia. The island endures, transformed and transforming, holding its secrets in narrow streets and crumbling archives, and the memories of those who remember what official histories forget. And somewhere in that vast archive of human experience, in the accumulated weight of all that has been lived and suffered and achieved, the story of a man who rose from chains to power waits to be told again. Waits for listeners who are ready to hear it. Waits to do what stories have always done, to illuminate the darkness, to challenge the certainties, to insist that the past has not finished speaking to us and never will.